Hi everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Kaylee. I'm a bookseller at Women and Children First. We are just one of a few feminist bookstores left, and we're so thankful you're spending an evening with us to celebrate the release of Jess Zimmerman's Women and Other Monsters, Building a New Mythology. Tonight she'll be in conversation with Kate Harding. We begin our virtual events as we begin our events in store with a land acknowledgement. Please join me in acknowledging that the land on which the bookstore stands is the occupied, unceded territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux people. We encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgements and about the rightful owners of the land where you are viewing tonight's event. A few simple logistics in just a few minutes or seconds even. I'll introduce Jess and Kate for a reading and then conversation and questions. If you'd like to ask a question, there's an Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. You can type your question in there, and that way we can easily keep track of it. There's also, of course, a chat if you want to say hello and, remark while the event is happening. And then finally, there's that handy Buy the Book button that will link to the Women and Children First website, where we ship nationwide or we have in-store or curbside pickup if you are local. And then the event will run about an hour. So thanks again for that. And then for our introductions. Kate Harding is the co-author of The Book of Jezebel and Lessons from the Photosphere, as well as the author of 2 books of nonfiction. The second, Victim Complex on Snowflakes, Witch Hunts, and the Cult of Personal Responsibility, will be out in 2022. She lives in Chicago. And Jess Zimmerman is the editor-in-chief of Electric Literature. Her essays, fiction, opinion pieces, and prose poetry have appeared in publications including Vice, Slate, The Cut, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and The New Republic. She lives in Brooklyn. Thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kaylee. Jess, do you want to read first?
Yeah, I'll do a little reading, just to give people, if they don't have the book, an idea of like what actually is in here.
Okay, good idea.
Okay.
Sorry. I'll also mute myself.
I do want to say before I start that this section has a word in it that is usually used as a slur against sex workers, and it feels very different to say it out loud than to write it. And there's also there's a part in here where I kind of contextualize it as a slur, and I'm skipping that part because the rest of the paragraph is a big quote. So essentially, much in the mode of like doing Fairy Tale of New York at karaoke, I'm just going to drop in a different word and say attention hog. So this is from the chapter Voracious, which is about Charybdis. Not every monster devours, but the drive to consume, to gobble up children or swallow the sun or eat young women's hearts, is considered a monstrous trait. Outsize hunger is the province of the monster, and for women, all hungers are outsize. For a person who has learned to make herself physically and emotionally small, to live literally and figuratively on scraps, admitting to any appetite at all is admitting to monstrous gluttony. Women are often on a diet of the body, but we are always on a diet of the heart. The low-maintenance woman, the ideal woman, has no appetite. This is not to say that she refuses food, sex, romance, emotional effort. To refuse is petulant, which is ironically more demanding. The woman without appetite politely finishes what's on her plate and declines seconds. She is satisfied and satisfiable. A man's appetite can be hearty, but a woman with an appetite is always voracious. Her hunger always overreaches because it is not supposed to exist. If she wants food, she is a glutton. If she wants sex, she is a slut. If she wants emotional caretaking, she is a high-maintenance bitch, or worse, an attention hog. An amalgam of sex hunger and care hunger, greedy not only to be fucked and paid, but most unforgivably of all, to be noticed. The attention hog is every low-maintenance woman's dark mirror, the void of hunger we fear is hiding beneath our calculated restraint. It doesn't take much to be considered an attention hog. Any manifestation of that deeply natural need to be noticed and attended to is enough. You don't have to be secretly needy to worry. You just have to be secretly human. As a child, on an endless restrictive regimen that started when I was 4, I was told, if you get used to eating less, you'll stop being so hungry. The secret to satiation, to satisfaction, was not to meet or even acknowledge your needs, but to curtail them. We learn the same lesson about our emotional hunger. Want less, and you will always have enough. The enchantress Circe knows all about the risks of thoughtless consumption. When she's introduced in Homer's Odyssey, she turns Odysseus's crew into pigs after they gorge themselves on the drugged food she offers them. It's one of the few times that men in myth are punished for their appetites, and naturally, it's the work of an unnatural woman. It's also only the anonymous shipmen who fall for Circe's deceit. Odysseus himself is too crafty for the enchantress, too remarkable a hero to be kneecapped by his greed. After he rescues his men, he takes Circe to bed, and then remains on her island for a full year, feasting and fucking. But once it's time for him to leave, Circe warns him again about the danger of hunger. His route, she tells him, will lead between two hazards: fearsome Scylla, who darts out 6 toothy heads to snatch 6 men from every ship that passes, and the even more terrible Charybdis, the implacable maelstrom, who sucks down water ravenously enough to destroy any craft. In modern-day parlance, when we talk about navigating between Scylla and Charybdis, we mean doing a tricky tightrope walk to avoid 2 disastrous outcomes. But Circe's advice is unambiguous. Hug the Scylla side and take your losses. It's better to sacrifice 6 of your men to a beast than to lose your whole crew to the vortex. If you must choose, even a vicious woman is better than a hungry one. Charybdis is a whirlpool, a force of nature, but like hurricanes of old, an unambiguously female one. Anthropologist David Gilmour describes her as a voracious, man-eating female sea monster, a watery virago. In Servius's commentary on Virgil's Aeneid, he tells the story of Charybdis's origins. She was a voracious woman who was cast into the sea by Zeus as a punishment for stealing Heracles' cattle. It's not specified whether she proposed to eat them, but it seems safe to assume. There, she retains her original voracious nature by continuing to swallow everything. That word, voracious, comes up over and over again to describe Charybdis. She's not only hungry, she is fueled by hunger, defined by it, driven by it. This is what makes her terrible, more terrible than Scylla, who will consume men, but only in known quantities. Charybdis's hunger is bottomless. Charybdis, says Gilmour, represents an archetypal dream image, that of losing control, being powerless, falling prey to powers beyond natural control. He's talking about men's fear, Odysseus's fear. But how much more terrifying must her boundless appetite be to Charybdis herself? She's been banished, punished, cast into the sea, but she can't stop feeding. Charybdis is a cautionary tale, not only to sailors, but to women. Hunger destroys those around you. Hunger destroys control. Okay, Kate, you can come back now.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, you're a podcast expert already.
It took me a minute there. Sorry I dropped out so quickly, but I really wanted you to read so that people could hear that if they haven't had a chance to read the book yet, or to read your essays on Catapult that started this, because I wanted that to go before what I'm going to say, which is we have been friends for a very long time, and I am not a person who's jealous of my friends. I'm not typically a writer who's jealous of other writers. I have done a lot of therapy to be able to say that. But reading this, even though I read some of it in draft form, I've been reading you for years. It just took my breath away, Jess. It's so good that it made me feel that stab of like, I hate her.
I mean, I'm not exactly a writer who's jealous of other writers, but I do like there's that feeling is actually in the book, because one of the chapters, Hydra, is kind of about the way that we are taught to be at odds with each other, as though like there can only be one feminist writer.
Right.
And if somebody is better than you, like even in this very moment, that diminishes you in some way. But I talk about how like my friend Helena and I, she is so good. She's so much of a better writer than me. But she says the same thing about me. And so every time she writes anything, and anytime I write anything, we just text each other being like, how dare you?
Right.
And you know, I'll text her that. She'll be like, no, it's bad. And I'll be like, you're right, it's bad. It's terrible. How dare you?
Yes, well, that definitely gave me how dare you feelings. I just love this book.
I think feeling that way is sort of part and parcel of, you know, some of the ways that we're sort of trained to be socialized with each other.
Oh, like, definitely. Yeah.
Like, react with like, oh, well, that takes away from me in some way, which
right.
all the time, like every time.
Well, of course, we know the opposite is true because, of course, years ago, Anne Friedman and Aminatou Sow talked about shine theory and the idea that, surrounding yourself with awesome people makes all of you look better. And I often, and that's how I usually feel. And of course, that is how I feel. I am thrilled for you too. I think what I said to you in text today was something like, I hate you in the most loving possible way.
No, I take it in exactly the way you intended. But yeah, I mean, and we've also we've seen it happen, right? Because we were writing on sort of the feminist internet on blogs, a decade plus ago, and it felt so fringe. But was everybody who was sort of there at the time has been boosting each other. Like a lot of those people are now very, very, established. So
right.
If kind of being established within media is the same.
But I mean, we also saw the other thing. I'm sorry, my radiator is making radiator noises that are horrible right now. It sounds like,
as long as it's not a ghost, it's fun.
Yeah, well, it could go either way.
Why not?
And I think it can be hard to, and talking about, there can only be one and that kind of thing. It's like when you get known for writing a certain kind of thing, I think you have done a lot of different things in your career where you were a journalist, you worked at Fact Check for a long time, you've been a blogger, both publicly and not so much. And then you started writing these essays that really, that sort of were more in this vein, and that you were publishing in places like Hazlitt and Catapult. Can you talk about that transition and what happened when you started writing those kinds of essays?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, to me, it feels like, oh, I just, speaking of whirlpools, like it kind of feels like, oh, I just stopped fighting it. Like I had these sort of very strong ideas about what qualified as, good or valid writing. And it was based almost entirely on what I found hard.
Yeah.
Obviously writing must be better if it's harder. And so if it's deeply researched, if it's I think I definitely thought that, when I was at Fact Check, I was doing a lot of difficult and sometimes tedious reporting. And I was like, okay, this I'm proud of, that I went through, pages and pages of receipts from, what kind of food and snacks and booze the, congressional, what do they call them? Codels were getting on, on plane rides. And so that felt very worthwhile because it was hard. And where that comes from, I don't know. Some of it is just kind of, Puritan mindset, which I have no business having. But it's just, you feel like, oh, well, you got to put your nose to grindstone. So I thought that maybe the highest form of writing was boots on the ground reporting that was also, giving you some kind of bigger story. So I was like, okay, Mary Roach, that's the kind of book that is a book.
Right.
That's what I call a book. And I still think that in the sense that's wonderful and I love to read it. But I did get to a point where I was just I could write an opinion. And it doesn't even have to be smart. And part of me, I think, was looking at what men get away with. And then also just sort of, some of it was just working with really good editors who were very good at sort of not only drawing that out, but also kind of encouraging me not to overthink it. But it really did come from kind of being okay, well, this is the kind of writing that I find less hard and less unpleasant.
Right.
And maybe I should try doing that for a while.
Yeah, it's kind of one of the nicer things about aging is it's oh, what if it's so many other things just become kind of background baseline hard that you want to stop overdoing it on other things.
Yeah, well, and I did get to a point, and this was probably later than I had kind of switched my writing mode, but it is part of the same kind of instinct where I was okay, well, I'm not going to not be like this.
Yeah.
I am too old to change. So then you get to the point where you're essentially putting the laundry hamper under the spot where you throw your dirty clothes.
Right.
And That's kind of what like going into an essay mode was for me. I was like, this is the way that I think is kind of in extended metaphors and making these sort of connections between pop culture and literature and feminism and all of these things. So like perhaps there's actually some value in that.
Right. And that's actually, I love that your reading selection sort of showed all the layers that you go through in this book, where everything sort of ties to your own personal experience, a monster from Greek mythology, and then sort of the present day situation for women and a feminist analysis of all that. And you managed to tie it all together in a way that makes complete sense, where you couldn't pull any one of those elements out. And I think that's the work of an essayist, is to, find those connections that other people might not make and draw them out. And it can be deeply personal because that then zooms out to the universal.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the stuff that if I write about personal stuff, like it's always there almost on the same footing as any one of those other threads. Like, I don't think of this as like a personal essay book that also has some monsters and some feminism or whatever about it. Like, it's just like, okay, one of the things that I have at my disposal is I have personal anecdotes, or I have like, I have had some version of this experience that I think a lot of people have had.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I can write about that one because, again, don't have to do more research.
Right.
Already was there. I'm not sure. I had to like look at my old live journal for this.
I was going to say, in many ways, this is like a very researched book. It's just that it's researched in more of a fun way. It's not that I had to call a million experts. It's allowing yourself to be enough of an expert in things to be able to talk about them and to go out and find, some reading that supports. I mean, you also read, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, all of those things. And
I mean, it's true that, like, I looked at the sources when I got the physical book and I was like, what? Who did that? Like, it's many pages and it's also small. Right.
This person read a lot of books.
I wish they told me what was in them.
Right. But you said the kernel of it goes back to childhood and being obsessed with mythology.
Yes. Yeah. And specifically about D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths, which I can't remember. Were you a D'Aulaire's kid?
I was not. And now I kind of like that reading about it made me sad that I wasn't.
You seem like you would be. I mean, there is like a particular kind of person, and we do often turn out to be writers. Or possibly I just know a lot of writers. But it does, like, I think there's a particular kind of sort of whimsical kid who really latches on to this book, which I wish, I've talked about it so many times now in in like these book events, that I wish I had a copy. My copy disintegrated.
Oh yeah, you talk about that in the book.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think it still exists, but it's absolutely in tatters. And I was very, very, very into it when I was a kid, and I was absolutely, I mean, I talk about this in the intro, that I was like, this like precocious little 4-year-old kind of toddling around the museum being like, oh, that's Artemis. And so that's very sort of in my blood. And so I think that's, it's kind of a metaphor that I reach for if I'm trying to kind of make sense of the world. But it's also, these are in kind of the blood of Western culture in the same way. And these are the metaphors that, literature and art reach for when they're trying to make sense of the world. And we absolutely haven't shaken that off.
Yeah, they're so foundational that, like, even not having been a myth nerd, never having studied classics, like, none of these concepts were unfamiliar to me, even though you taught me a lot of things that I didn't know. Talk to me about why monsters are always female.
Well, so they're not always, but they are a lot. And a lot of the time, even if they're not explicitly female, they're not explicitly male either. And I think that the reason, there's sort of one guy who's like the main monster theory guy, which is Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, and his kind of idea of the monster is that the monstrous is what kind of defines for us what's possible and what's natural, and things that, and like polices those boundaries, and things that go beyond it are grotesque in some way. And so that's how we kind of define monstrosity, as things that that go outside of what's supposed to be possible. And so being in a group that tends to be constrained, tends to be culturally constrained, and have these kind of a perceived need for these cautionary tales about this is what happens when you overstep and this is what happens when you overgrow. That's a lot of the time that's women. I say sort of in the intro that, when I say women, that's a category that's kind of imposed on us. It's not, these rules about that and constraints about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. They generally don't ask you first how you actually identify. So people who have had these imposed on them, maybe women, may not be, may just be assigned female at birth, maybe women now, but not assigned female at birth, may not, ever have identified or presented as women, because sometimes men are just put in this feminized space. And so that's something that happens also, is that either the kind of monstrosity or the like metamorphosis, which happens a lot to women in Greek myth, where they just like turn into a tree or they turn into a river or whatever. This happens to men sometimes too, but they often are men who are feminized in some way. And so and it's because of the sort of the monstrosity, and the hybridity is a cautionary tale about what's allowed and what's not allowed.
Right. And my next question was about hybridity. That you talk about that being a major factor in a lot of them, that it's the very fact of being more than one thing at once, which I think, is very rich as a metaphor in terms of, not being this very narrowly defined thing is threatening.
Yeah. And definitely Greek monsters are they're not all like half woman and half whatever. A lot of them are, a lot of the ones in the book are, but there's also, like, for instance, there's Cerberus, who's just, 3 dogs. There was a tweet going around while I was working on this a couple of years ago that was like going back to some primary source, I can't remember which one, but saying like, and in addition to 3-head, Cerberus may have had 3 bodies. And everybody was like, so he's just 3 dogs?
3 dogs, right?
That's great. That's just 3 dogs. So you have that, and you have, like half horse and half fish and whatever. So there's a lot of this hybridity, but the hybridity is essentially standing in for, for sort of breaking outside of the boundaries of what is expected and what's familiar.
Sure.
And so like a monster that is part woman and part something else, first of all, unfamiliar, sort of troubles all of our ideas about what each of those things are. And then also there's the factor that I describe in here as, what a beautiful lady. Now it's time to take a big sip of my coffee and look at the rest of her body. Where there's a lot of them that have, they have a woman's face, or they have a woman's face and a woman's torso. And then, you get to the rest and you're like, what? That specific. And for some of these, that became more true over time, right? So like images of Medusa used to be like really grotesque and have, tusks and wild hair, stuff like that, wings. And then she became just like a very beautiful woman with kind of flowing snaky tresses. And so there's sort of that element of like any woman could be monstrous. Like this is something that's hidden, and that you only discover once it's too late.
Right. Speaking of Medusa, that is your essay on beauty, which is something that we, met writing and thinking about beauty and fatness and how we engage with the world. I did have a lot of what I did here in terms of preparing was just like write down a quote and a note, like make her talk about that. So I wanted to read the whole quote here, though. Beauty is a currency, but it's also a baseline, the place you have to stand to be noticed, the thing that makes you real. Talk about that, about how beauty is the thing that makes you real. And socially speaking, you're not, I want to clarify that the context there is you're saying that that's what the message that we get, not.
Right. Yeah, definitely. This is definitely all in the frame of like, that's, this is sort of an observer imposing these things on you. And and this is something that comes along, I think, with the fact that we're talking about specifically feminine or feminized beauty and this like feminine beauty ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And it really goes along with the idea of monstrosity versus kind of a predictable and familiar, normal, like understandable shape, right? Mm-hmm. Because that understandable shape is very, very narrowly defined in terms of what's acceptable. And we definitely see that in terms of feminine beauty. Like that's essentially what I end up talking about in that essay is like, there are so many ways to not fit that ideal. And there's only, it's this very, very narrow coffin that you're kind of squeezing yourself into. And so if you have set it up so that's what counts as sort of human, right? Then anything that's outside of there becomes, in a way, to the people who have this expectation, becomes imperceptible because it's not interpretable. Right. So you kind of don't know what you're looking at. And this is something that I think a lot of us have, I started to talk about, like Lena Dunham talked about at one point about like feeling that a man was looking at her and saying, I don't know what this is. like that sucked because for like so many reasons, because like you can't tell other people what they're thinking when they're looking at you, because they're being real people, and you can't just like narrate their interior lives. And then there was any number of reasons that her like sort of choosing to narrate his experience with her was fucked up. But that's specific, and I think you and I talked about this at the time. It's like, well, that's a fucked up thing to say, but the experience is one that like we do recognize having. And whether that's something that somebody is really thinking, looking at you, or just something that you're kind of projecting onto them because, we kind of swallow all of these expectations and then impose them on ourselves. It's this kind of self-perpetuating engine.
Right.
But I think we've all kind of had the experience of either thinking that we're seeing someone looking at us and saying, I don't know how to interpret that, or feeling that way about ourselves and saying, I don't know how to interpret this, because it just doesn't look like the image that I'm used to.
Right. And you talk about the phenomenon of people, people being like, women won't talk to me, women won't do this, women won't acknowledge me. And they don't mean women. They mean a certain type of woman that is the only one that they acknowledge as real and worthy. And I think, it's interesting. That was just sort of an aside, because I also want to get to the point that you make, that is because beauty is such a small, I think you call it such a tiny space, and everything that is not beauty then is so much more expansive. Like, we're talking about how it's invisible, but you also say that it can be a kind of power, that there are just so many other ways to be if you stop trying to be beautiful.
Yeah, it's just sort of this uncharted wilderness that then it's like, okay, well, maybe I make a home here. But I don't think that is a tangent to talk about, like, when people say, oh, women don't this and women don't that, because I think that like a lot of people, certainly like the people that I have in mind when I'm writing, but just like also just I think a lot of fat women and a lot of women who are just not conventionally beautiful in any number of ways have had that experience of listening to somebody talking directly to us, saying women do this and women don't that, and being like, excuse me, like, I'm right here.
Sorry.
And it's just like sort of an introduction to the experience of being invisible, basically. It's like
I found it interesting too, because you also talk about how aging is more and more becoming a factor in that, and you hear so many middle-aged women. We're both over 40, and I'm 5 years older than you. But so many women our age talk about becoming invisible, and I have often had I don't want to be resentful, but had this reaction of like, I have always been invisible. And it's, it's funny. Some of that was just how harshly I judged myself. And then some of it is also like one of the things you talk about, the beauty is an action, that it is something you can buy. And I'm sitting here like, oh, I don't look so bad on camera right now. I'm wearing really expensive makeup. I couldn't afford that when I was young and had much worse skin.
Yeah, and so one of the things that is funny that I do also talk about is that like I do have that experience of being like, oh, I don't feel that I've become invisible once I hit 40, because I was to a certain degree always invisible. But I also like it's like the thing where you look back at pictures of yourself when you're 24 and you're like, oh, I was cute. Why did I so bad? And I have that experience with the way that people treated me. And so this is the other thing about beauty, like, is like, it's not just an expectation that, you know, it's not just a sort of a nebulous expectation, right? It's that there are tangible benefits.
Yes.
The better you do at it, the more tangible benefits there are. And so I do have the experience, being over 40, of looking back and being like, oh, I got stuff for free.
Right.
Like, it must have been a lot cuter than I thought, because people were giving me stuff.
Yeah.
And I think I have a line in here that's like, if you think that people don't give you things for being beautiful, then it's because like you just don't know what it's like to not.
Yeah, it's the 30 Rock episode with when Liz is dating John Hamm, and the bubble of how nicely everyone teaches him. I want to acknowledge some of the chats first. I want to note that Sarah Miller said, wait, men are people.
I love you, Sarah.
Okay, well, hi, Sarah. And Laura, I want to also encourage everybody who's listening, please hit the ask a question button at the bottom. I see the chat is starting to happen a little bit. And I will watch that, but also feel free to ask your own questions. You don't have to wait till the end. So Laura made a comment ages ago when we were talking about things. She said, similar to the sirens depicted as beautiful in many paintings, but are described as being surrounded by men's corpses and stench.
Yeah.
Which is a great segue into the sirens, which what I wanted to ask you about there is that in your siren essay, you talk a lot about what is the sirens' version of the story. Are they actually monsters, or are they doing this for survival? And if you can just expand on that a little.
Yeah, I mean, they're, you know, of all of the monsters, maybe not of all of them, but like I felt very interested in the question of what happens when you turn around the siren story. Because I mean, just to back up for the sirens, like the deal with them is they are bird women. They live on this sort of very lonely, craggy rock. They sing extremely beautifully. If you sail past them and you hear them singing, you will jump into the water and drown. And there are a couple of ways to avoid this. And, you know, so we hear a couple, you know, several different stories of heroes who manage to avoid jumping in the water and drowning. But their basic thing is you hear them, you jump in the water and drown. And there are a couple of reasons why, you know, that feels like, even more than some monster stories, like one in which their perspective is very missing, because you get no sense from this story of like, are they singing at people? Like, that's not really implied. Right. You don't see them in the Odyssey or the story of the Argo. I don't think. Like, we know that they're bird women because they're depicted that way. They're not described. So the heroes, you know, they hear them, they don't see them. So like, what are they doing over there? You know, they have presumably their whole like sort of siren society and their whole siren life, and they're singing their siren songs. And then, you know, so then like if a man comes by and decides to, you know, and I sort of say this, because that chapter is sort of all about the idea of seduction, and what it means in this case is that men are sort of making themselves promises about your body that you're not really necessarily involved in. And this kind of what happens with the sirens. But also, you know, we don't know what they were singing about. Like, perhaps they were making promises. Perhaps they were just, you know, this is something that a whole lot of poets and musicians have kind of theorized. You know, are they saying something reassuring? Are they saying something, you know, are they telling Odysseus the story of the Odyssey so that he sounds like a really brilliant hero? Are they saying, please jump in the water and drown? You know, there's a number of different, but we don't know anything about sort of their experience. The one thing that we do know is that there are stories in which if a sailor manages to ignore them, that they'll die. Mm-hmm. So essentially they're in this place where like they are entirely off stage, framed as this kind of obscure danger, and at the same time, like if someone manages to defeat them by ignoring them, that is literal death to them.
Right.
And so that combination of things was very interesting to me in terms of kind of turning that around and being like, okay, well, what's the siren's perspective?
Yeah, that they're if you look at it from theirs, they're doing this for their own survival.
Yeah.
Versus, they are cast in a way that not coincidentally is how we often look at women who are found seductive, that it's their own reasons for doing anything don't matter because the man perceives it all as, this is destructive to me, therefore her entire reason for being is to destroy me.
Right, exactly. And we still use the word siren for women that we think are behaving that way. And that's part of the reason that, that this book came about, really, is that so many of these stories are like still embedded in our language that we don't even interrogate.
Yeah, Andy just said the birth of negging, which is why when I randomly snicker and Jess hasn't said anything funny, it's because I just.
I mean, I'm glad you're watching the chat. I always feel like if I look at the chat and also try to talk like a human, that
totally. I figure that is actually my job, and also ADHD helps. So. Okay, we do have a couple of audience questions. So Lauren Bruce asks, after your research, did you feel personal affinity for any of the monsters?
Oh, all of them. Oh my God, all of them. I mean, there's definitely some of them that I feel sort of more and that I was less able to kind of get into their head. And actually Sirens is one of them. And I talk about this in there that like not having really been perceived as seductive, especially at any point, like that's something that I recognize happening and I understand it. And like, I maybe recognize it as something that operates on me, but it's not really something that I recognize as a subject. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the sort of point here is that all of these are all of us. And, all of them are representing something that, you may not choose to have these feelings in your life. Some of them are unpleasant feelings. One of the things that I think we should have at our disposal is anger, and anger is very, very bad. So like, I don't judge anybody for being like, I'm going to pass on that one. But all of these are traits and behaviors that we're discouraged from, and that it is important to have in your repertoire, kind of to be a fully realized human. And so there are things that we're discouraged from and that we therefore like almost feel like a phantom limb, like we understand that they're kind of taken away from us. And so, yeah, I think every one of them I had some level of affinity with.
Yeah, I think I might be most fond of, or I don't know if I would say most fond, but the one that really struck me was the way you described Scylla. And in part because she's part dog. And as you say, waking up and realizing you're 3 dogs below the waist might not be the worst.
And she's the one on the cover too. And
yeah, so she is.
One of them, yeah.
But she, the way you describe her kind of looking down and realizing that, and that horror of realizing that you're something that, you didn't know you were and didn't want to be, and it's out of your control, is, again, just all richly metaphoric.
Yeah. Well, and, I talked, can I tell tales out of school about your reproductive system?
Yes.
Not
or lack thereof.
Well, right. So I talked in there about having the experience of going to a medical museum and seeing like an embalmed, I think, polycystic kidney, which is a disease that I have. I don't actually know. I didn't know at the time. I still don't know. But the idea, I am very hard to upset at medical museums. And because you've been to them with me. But that like really upset me to kind of be like, oh, this thing might be in my body in a malign way. And so then when we went to the medical museum in Edinburgh and I saw like some uterine fibroids in a jar, and I like stopped you at the end of this, and I was like, just before you go down here, just know like there's some things in here that are in your body. And like we were in Europe on what we were partially calling my farewell uterus tour, because it was right before it struck me for that. And it was amazing because I'm like
overall, I am much less into gross medical oddities, but for me, it was like, oh, that's making it real. Like these are just kind of this concept that's wreaking havoc on my life. And now I can see that it's, you know, which just says so much about how much we're told that things are all in our head, especially when they have to do with our reproductive system. That seeing that jar of gross uterine tumors made me feel like, oh.
Yeah, no, but it's true. Like it's almost two sides of the same experience of being kind of disconnected from your body and being told to be disconnected from your body and encouraged to be disconnected from your body. It's like either you're going to react to it where you're like, this is horrifying to me, or you're going to react to it like, wait, my body is real?
Yeah.
Real? Yeah.
Right. Well, and as you said, you know, we are both brain in a jar kind of people. So it's kind of nice to have those reminders. Let's go for some more questions here. Megan asks, what chapter was your favorite to write and why? Can you pick a favorite, baby?
Yeah. I mean, you get to a point, and I am still at that point where you're kind of like, no, actually, all of it is very terrible. And I hated writing all of it. And I can tell you which one was the worst. But I don't think that's really true. I would say, so there were a couple of these where, in addition to kind of talking about myself, which is something that, you know, is kind of something that I have to practice and get better at and is interesting, and talking about mythology, which I love, and talking about feminism, which is easy. A few of them I also got to just talk about shit that I think is really cool. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, this is my book, and nobody can stop me from talking about the Schmidt Sting Pain Index, which is just like a ranking of how much it sucks to be bitten by various bugs.
Yes.
And like, nobody can tell me, at least until my editor gets her hands on this, which she didn't, like nobody can tell me that I can't like make a robust extended metaphor about the Schmidt Sting Pain Index. So those ones were very fun. That's the Furies one, has the Sting Pain Index. The one about the Chimera has a whole thing about the House on the Rock, which is like a tourist attraction in Wisconsin that is absolutely bonkers and that I'm obsessed with.
Right. This is a largely Chicago audience, so I bet a lot of us know.
Yeah, you guys, because I actually came to, I visited Minneapolis when we were going to the House on the Rock. So that doesn't, I mean, I think if you were angling for like which monster was the most fun to write, they were all great and horrible in equal measure, because in every case you're kind of like, oh, I'm facing up to something that essentially has been denied me. But in terms of what chapters were most fun to write, it was the ones where I just got to like talk about the House on the Rock or like describe an Aerosmith video.
That was also a really good one. All right, we have another question from Kwanzaa, I hope I am saying that right, who says, I love mythology, and I've been trying to use mythology to connect to my heritage. My dad is from Ghana, and my mom is from the Mississippi Delta. As a kid, my mom bought me an Anansi storybook and told me Brer Rabbit tales. As a Black woman, I've been a little sad that there's so little information available on the, is it Akan gods? The Orishas, Brer Rabbit, except for that movie Disney wishes everyone would forget, etc. Did you find any info on these mythologies in your research?
So I actually kept specifically focused on Greek antiquity for a couple of reasons. One of which is that, like we were saying earlier, it is kind of the thing that has left the largest footprint on Western culture, and then Western culture is the thing that's left the largest footprint, for better or for worse, mostly worse, on kind of American culture right now. And so I was sort of like, okay, these are these unexamined stories that are still kind of delivering their payloads into our brains. They're coming down from the sort of, white male Western canon. And so we don't, like, we're still trying to shake them. We're still trying to question them. We're still trying to understand sort of their influence on us. I said something in here about how these are the bedtime stories that patriarchy tells itself. And then also, it's something that I feel like, okay, I'm in a position where I can talk about Western culture and be like, it's very sexist.
Yes.
I feel that. I'm not going to say that about anybody else's culture.
Yeah, good point.
So
yeah, the nature of this meant you don't want to be criticizing something that is not, in fact.
Right. It's just not criticized.
Yeah.
So those gods would be outside of kind of the research that the ambit of research that I was doing. I will say that a lot of these myths, we don't have a lot of the original stories. You know, we have fragments, we have the ways that the stories came down, you know, and the ways that they were kind of reanimated, sometimes in like Renaissance literature and art. We have, you know, sometimes like a commentator talking about a play that we no longer have. So I did have to do a lot of sort of reconstruction, and I feel like you can do that reconstruction also with kind of what it is that you have and do a similar kind of thing with those stories. And I would love to read it.
Yes.
I can't write it because like that's like I just don't have the authority to write something like that, but I definitely read it. And so I would say like don't be discouraged by having only partial stories, because what you bring to it is like we're all kind of we're both the transmitters and the objects of stories. You know, stories are supposed to work on us. That's why they exist. They exist to do something to you. And so part of the story is whatever remains, you know, whatever has been recorded, whatever has been orally passed down. And then part of the story is the way that you experience that story and how whatever work it does on you. And right. that's not like that's if anything like maybe the most important part. So essentially I want to hear your versions of all of this, and like just do this. I would love if so many people, Jamie Nakamura-Lin has been writing about East Asian monsters for Catapult and doing kind of similar work. And I think may be thinking about doing a book or may have a book in the works. Very excited about that. I want people to do this exact book for like every other mythology.
Right. And of course, part of the problem too is that because these have left, you know, their footprint so hard on all of Western civilization and our, you know, everything that we're still reading and talking about today, that crowds out all of the other stories that we could have been learning and all of the other traditions. So,
yeah,
you know, like I said, all of these are in my brain, and I have only, you know, I've heard some Anansi stories, I've heard rabbit stories, but it's just, you know, this is presented to us as somehow the Greeks are, you know, white American. And
I mean, there's a reason that like that they're called the classics, right? And that
right.
also like things being classy or high class or classical, because it does like it crowds everything else out, and then it also is kind of self replicating like a virus, right? Because like these stories kind of got inside Renaissance literature, and then all of Renaissance literature is kind of harking back to these and art. And then like anything that looks back to Renaissance literature for its sense of kind of what is literary and what is valuable and what is artistic is going to be going back to these same stories. So it has a way of kind of just recombining that DNA and continuing to perpetuate itself. So whatever we can do, I think, to interrupt that at this point, like I feel like what I can do is kind of analyze the stories into bits so that we think twice about them. Flooding in more stories is also like an amazing way, I think, to count.
All right, I think if anybody has more questions, please keep them coming with the question bottom at the bottom of the screen. Also, don't forget the buy the book button. I will go back to my questions. You have a line, let me see, page 59. So it's also in the Skella one where you say, you're talking about how all of this, yes, you are talking about how this intersects with disability, the whole thing of feeling not in your body, or rejected because of how your body is, etc. And you say, men love a fragile woman until she breaks. And that was one of those that's a great line that I'm going to say, that's a great line. Tell me something.
No, I mean, it's interesting because these two things are simultaneously true, right? Which is that that there is an entire, you know, and I sort of I gesture at this and I quote a lot of people, but there's, you know, again, whole other books that could be written about disability and beauty. And actually, I think one of the people that I quoted at length just got a Whiting Award, so hopefully she'll write that. Chloe Cooper Jones, that's her name, and she is extraordinary. And so there's a lot to be said about that from sort of within the disabled community. But it's also simultaneous, about how disability is seen as locking you out of beauty. It's also simultaneously true that certain kinds of illness are very valorized in sort of, like the consumptive beauty kind of thing. Because it makes you fragile, because it makes you childlike, because it makes you pale, right? Because all of these beauty ideals are also very white supremacist, because it makes you thin, because it makes you dependent. And so that's a sort of interesting tension, where essentially you are supposed to be like not exactly healthy, but also not at any point sick enough to make somebody reckon with the fact of your body and the real sort of animalness of it, which is one of the things that happens if you're really sick, whether you're, chronically sick or injured or acutely sick. You really have to reckon with like the animal nature of your body, and the fact that it is a thing that like smells and exudes and, needs things. And so I think that's kind of where the kind of beauty, the like sickness beauty ideal, which is so weird, and the sort of sickness reality come into are at loggerheads because if you're like the right kind of sort of fragile, it's supposed to make you ethereal, right? Which is the opposite of being embodied.
We came of age during what they actually called heroin chic, that like just not only incredibly thin but sickly looking, or right on that border where you could still be hot, but it completely makes sense that you can't be strong enough to be a threat, and you can't be weak enough to require care.
Right. And you're supposed to sort of be like the sort of ideal amount of fragility is to essentially be like right on the edge of being a ghost. Right. Yes. Which is like the least embodied you can be.
Yes, definitely. All right. I guess we're coming pretty close to the end. I want to ask about some of these you're just making a connection between here's the story, and some have very, they very directly affect us today. So I'm saying this poorly. What I'm thinking of are specifically harpies and furies, in that they are words that have meanings that apply to us today that come from these myths, and are used to disparage women. And I love that you say about furies, the word fury, as we use it today, implies a chaotic, unfocused frenzy of rage. But the furies embody justified anger, stemming from an adamantine moral code. Talk about that, about how somebody embodying justified anger, or a creature that does, then becomes something that it has a negative connotation.
Yeah, I mean, if your anger is justified, that is for an observer, well, not just an observer, right? For the target of that anger, that is doubly frightening, right? Because you're angry at them, and this is actually a fine. This doesn't have to be a gendered thing, right? If somebody is angry at you and they're right to be angry at you, like that sucks in multiple ways. It sucks that they're angry at you, and it sucks that also you feel guilty.
Yes.
That is a well-adjusted way of interacting with that. And so what we're kind of looking at instead, because of course men under patriarchy are not especially well-adjusted, is that what happens when women are both angry and justified, is that the reaction is to be angry in response to the anger and then defensive in response to the justification. And one of the like kind of defensive modes that happens when, men turtle up is to find some way of just discounting the justice of the anger and find some way of just unseating it, right? And so maybe that way, I didn't even get a chance. I know you had this problem with asking for it, that like things kept happening and you kept wanting to put it in the book. And so I didn't even have a chance to talk about like cancel culture and like the current cancel culture word. Like that wasn't, I think it was a thing when I was writing this, but it hadn't metastasized the way it has now. But that's one of the ways that people, you know, and another way is to say, oh, you're just a social justice warrior, which is ridiculous because like, oh, that's going to be your way of telling me that I'm not justified.
Right. Exactly.
To say that it's about justice, like, yeah, it is. Yeah. But so cancel culture is the same thing, is kind of, oh, well, I don't have to feel the guilt of your justified anger if I can find some way to discount that it's justified, and to let myself off the hook, to make this your foot, turn this back on you in some way. So, you know, that it keeps finding new outfits to wear.
And the more the culture does to constantly reinforce the message that certain people are not, like, their anger is never justified, period. And that's women, that's people of color, that's people with disabilities, that's trans people, that's queer people, that's everybody who is talking about justice and how they are denied it. So we're right, we're talking about it, we're mad about it, because we ought to be. And then just all of white supremacist patriarchy is like, no, calm down, little lady. Like,
yeah, and it just like they try so many different approaches, right? Which is like, oh, well, you're like, I don't like your you know, you shouldn't be so angry and yelling at me, or, you know, you're just looking for things to be offended by, or you're trying to censor me, or, you know, there's not really a cohesive strategy, because there doesn't at this point need to be.
Right.
Really, it's sufficient to kind of yell, help, I'm being repressed. But yeah, I think one of the things that is really important to hang on to in kind of trying to find a way to feel that anger and allow that anger, even when you're discouraged from it, and even when like it's very frustrating and doesn't feel good, is to sort of hold on to the fact that kind of the more justified the anger is, the more people tend to work hard to discount it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a couple more. I want to make sure, just one more call if anybody wants to ask a question. We've got like 3 minutes left. Otherwise, I would just say, Jess, do you have anything that we haven't covered yet that you would like to get to?
I never know.
I know. I can ask you something more specific if it helps. All right, let me see. Page 40. 40. Oh, this might be too big for 2 minutes left, but all right. So you're talking about how you, in your first marriage, kind of shrunk yourself down to never asking for anything, never wanting anything. And then you have what seems kind of counterintuitive, but I think it's a really awesome observation that you say, being too low maintenance, carving yourself hollow to make space for someone who never asked you to, is not actually a generous way to live. Because this, you know, it wasn't like you were with someone who was abusive. You were doing this to yourself because you didn't believe you deserved to ask for more.
Yeah, and it's something that I think a lot of us like have this kind of instinct, is to kind of never ask for anything, never take up space. And, you know, and this is sort of the way that these stories about what's monstrous and what's unacceptable perpetuate themselves, because you do start doing the work on the patriarchy's behalf.
Right.
And what it means is that you're obviously not existing generously in that relationship, because you're not existing in it really at all.
Right.
And that's not, like, in a sense, I blame myself, but I also don't blame myself. Like, of course I thought that was the way you know, that you were supposed to make room for other people. And that's the goal, is to make room for other people. Right. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of the flip side, right, of what I'm kind of advocating all throughout this, is like, there is always the option where you are afraid to put a foot wrong. You know that to sort of step outside of these boundaries and outside of these expectations is going to be seen as monstrous by somebody. And so the instinct is to avoid that. And that obviously doesn't do anything good for you. And in a lot of ways, I would say doesn't do anything good for anybody, because essentially what you're doing is just kind of taking yourself out of circulation.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a weird note to run right up to the end, but that was basically the last question I had written down. So again, this was so fun. I can't tell you how much I love this book, Jess. And I love you. It's so good to see your face.
Good to see you.
And everybody hit that buy the book button. And I think we're out. That was an hour.
Yeah.
I don't know if Kaylee's going to come back.
Yeah, sure. I think so.
Okay. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Sorry. Hi, Kaylee.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again so much for coming. It was a wonderful conversation. Again, there's that buy the book button at the bottom. And you can also, I highly recommend the audiobook on Libro FM is also incredible. But thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks.